Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. We are pleased to introduce you to Dr. Brian Furgione, Assistant Professor of Social Studies at the University of Redlands, as well as the University of Central Florida's own Dr. Scott Waring, Professor of Social Science Education. Dr. Waring brought this webinar series to us through UCF's partnership with Teaching Primary Sources in the Library of Congress. And in just a few seconds, I'll be turning it over to Dr. Furgione, where he will begin to discuss the use of political cartoons, environmentalism, and the creation of ethical dilemma. So with that, Dr. Waring, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say, and if so, please do. And after that, Dr. Furgione, it'll be all you.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. And I think we're pretty informal here, so I can go by Scott and Brian. I think you're comfortable with Brian. I can already speak for you, I think. But we do welcome everybody here. If you don't know me, I am a professor of social science education at the University of Central Florida, and I love what I do, and I love my collaborations with FCSS and the Library of Congress. And I also have to say a special plug to the Brinson Foundation at UCF, headed by Dr. Karen Brima, because through her funding, she was able to help support this webinar series. So I'm very grateful for that. At this point, I'll turn it over to Brian to introduce and then get us rolling. Thank you, Brian.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you. So we're going to go through a pretty cool investigation utilizing the sources framework, kind of discussing the notion of civic environmentalism through the lens of political cartoons, along with some other aspects here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can take a look at what I am seeing. Here we go. All right. And if you guys don't mind, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? All right. So you see our webinar agenda. Make sure I'm sharing the right screen, right? Okay, I'm seeing Robert and Noah there. All right, so some brief introductions and some welcomes, some political cartoons that we're going to talk about here, civic environmentalism, and then we're going to go through the investigation following the runoff. And this is going to predominantly look at Rachel Carson's work in Silent Spring and kind of the notion of the things that came following that in the modern environmental movement. And then we're going to wrap it up with some kind of cool debriefing and conversation, if you will. If you're not familiar with the sources framework as outlined, I don't know, Scott, if you want to jump in and just briefly overview the sources framework, just so that way if anybody has any questions or anything like that before we jump into the investigation, just to kind of set our stage, that would actually be fantastic if you're okay with that, Scott.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. So if you haven't seen this before, this is my framework that I've constructed. It's over 25 years in works, and I'll probably continue to modify and add to it as I move forward. But what I found was that even in my own education, but especially when I was seeing what was going on in the school systems and when I was teaching what my colleagues were doing, that there really wasn't authentic use of primary sources in a disciplined inquiry manner. And so I wanted to help find a way to facilitate that process. And for me, I tend to be an XYZ 1, 2, 3 kind of guy, and I like outlines. So I thought, is there a framework that really works for me? And there wasn't out there at that time when I was looking. So I started trying to construct a framework for helping people teach with primary and secondary sources. And I went a step beyond and thought, how can I try to work this into the word sources? Is it possible? And hopefully I have done this in a successful manner. So essentially what we do is going through the first stage of scrutinizing the fundamental source. I don't like giving students 10, 15, 20 sources and asking them to think about writing a dissertation. I would like them to start with one fundamental source, maybe 2 or 3 if you have the need. Sometimes you like an image with some text and you can put them in combination. But typically what I like to do is take one fundamental source and think of what essential question can help guide an investigation or an inquiry. The second stage, and hopefully this will make a little more sense as Brian's going through with an example. So I'm just gonna run through this quickly, not to take up his time. But the second stage is really having them organize their thoughts. So right now, what do they know after only seeing one source? Many times their answer is very little, and that's okay, and it helps you as a teacher to move forward. The third stage is understanding the context. As we all probably know, we need to make sure that those sources are understood, read, viewed, whatever, analyzed within the context. So that may be within space and time, as well as other elements. The fourth stage is reading between the lines. So at this point in time, one thing I should also add is understanding context. I also try to bolster their background knowledge. And a lot of times I do that through children's literature. So building up their understanding of that context so they can now, in the fourth stage, read between the lines. So basically revisiting that fundamental source. And they have a very different perspective and understanding of that fundamental source at this point in time, once their context has been built. In the next stage is corroborate and refute. So that's that stage that I never got the chance to do, and many of us didn't, is to be able to create your own narrative rather than just reading the text and having to believe whatever it says. So what I argue is we need to not only corroborate their understandings at this point in time, whatever that narrative that is starting to be constructed, they also need to think about how might you refute that and actually analyze and engage with sources that may not coincide with whatever narrative's being constructed. In the second to last stage, we think about establishing the plausible narrative. And I love the word plausible because I was always told that there was a truth with a capital T and there was only one narrative for everything that I learned in the social studies classroom. And so I like to explain to students and talk about, we try to establish the most plausible narrative based on the evidence, so an evidence-based narrative. And in the last stage, I think is extremely important is summarizing their final thoughts. So students get a chance to think critically about what they've learned about this particular subject, but also this metacognitive reflection where they can think about, how did I learn? What worked for me? What did not work? How might I modify this in the future? And Brian, if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see some of the resources that I've been working on with an analysis sheet for primary sources, and then also a framework analysis sheet as the students are going through each of the stages of the framework. So those are available on the site, as well as teachingwithsources.com, which I'm trying to build. It's not really out there and ready yet, but if anybody has feedback for me ever, I would love that. And if you go to the next tab, Brian, I can just quickly say that I have published many pieces up at the, yeah, thank you. Many pieces around the framework. So here are just some of the chapters and articles that are associated, or I work in these, as you can see, with co-authors, and these are in-service teachers. So what I've done is provided some of these articles here, at least the APA reference. But if you want any and all of these, please let me know. I think, yeah, I was gonna say on the About Us, my contact, Brian put me on there graciously, even though this is his session, he put me on there as well. So then you can contact me directly if you want any of those. And then actually what you see on the screen right now is a book. Oh yeah, so it's all right there, is a book that I just published through Teachers College Press. It is focused in on the sources framework. If you want to email me, which is on that About Us, email me and I'll get a copy out to you in the mail in a couple weeks after you contact me. I'd be more than happy to get you a copy of the book. And so hopefully that gives you a quick overview. I don't want to take too much of Brian's time. So at this point in time, I'll turn it back over to you, Brian.
Excellent. Thanks, Scott. So welcome again, everybody. And just to reiterate, Brian Furgione, I taught in Seminole County Public Schools for close to a decade before jumping into the higher ed setting as an assistant professor of social studies education at the University of Redlands. My predominant focus has been civics. And as a green person, if you will, environmentalism and civic environmentalism has been a focus of mine in terms of research, as also civic action with students. So just to kind of set the stage, I want to talk briefly about civic environmentalism and political cartoons, just from a holistic lens to kind of set our understanding here. This session will not necessarily go into deep scientific research, right? But I do want to note that it's a great opportunity for cross-curricular collaboration with science teachers or with ELA teachers as we start getting into those resources. We'll talk a little bit about that. So briefly to go over kind of political cartoons, right? We're very used to seeing them in the 21st century, right? I know for myself, I used to grow up, my grandfather worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. So every Sunday we would sit down at the table as young as I can remember, and we would look at those political cartoons along with the funny pages. And as I got older, you know, I would get a Sunday paper and I'd open up to the opinion section, the editorial section, take a look at these cartoons, and they really capture the moment, right? They really contextualize what's going on. So political cartoons from a historic lens, right? They began as a street level phenomenon, right? In the late 18th and 19th centuries, they'd be posted on walls or posted in buildings. So persons would walk around, they'd see these things, and they often were published in newspapers. By the end of the 19th century, they were pervasive, right? They were an important part of the growing popularity of magazines and newspapers. And they were used to gain readership, right? They made provocative cartoons, cartoons that had a valuable point that was supposed to be made, that was going on with the contemporary issues at the time. And so for us now in the 21st century, we sit down and political cartoons are everywhere, right? They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're still in the newspaper, and they still stir up that controversy that really drives us to understand a greater concept, that an issue is being discussed. However, right, the political cartoons, editorial cartoons do come with a bias. They do come with that author perspective. And so for us, when we're dealing with political cartoons with our students, we really want to understand that political cartoons in general are pictures with a point. They have an author that is trying to persuade you of something. Maybe it's to bring light to a topic, maybe it's to amuse you, but a good political cartoon makes you think about the events, and that author, that creator, is trying to sway your opinion towards that cartoonist point of view. And they use a lot of different techniques. So you might be familiar with some of these persuasive techniques. They're things that our students have to work on and really kind of develop the skills to engage with. So they're going to be using symbolism and exaggeration. They're going to be using labeling to explicitly note different things or objects. They're going to use a lot of analogies and a lot of irony within the context of the cartoon. So for our students to engage with editorial and political cartoons, they really need to understand a greater context. But I love using political cartoons because they're a great access point. You don't necessarily need to read 40 pages of text to place an issue in a surrounding kind of contextual example. But we do need to be able to analyze it. We have to understand what issue the political cartoon is trying to address, what the cartoonist's opinion is on the topic, if there's other opinions that are not being discussed within the cartoon itself, and of course, understanding those persuasive techniques that are being utilized and leveraged. And so when we think about political cartoons, that's the context that I'm hoping to engage with within this webinar and this session today. And then very briefly, discussing a little bit more from the perspective of civic environmentalism as we kind of liken it to what we're talking about here. First off, we can get into a ridiculous conversation that would take way too long than what we have here about the environmental movement and civic environmentalism specifically. And I know I noted this before, but just to reiterate, a great opportunity for cross-curricular work and collaboration with a science teacher, with an ELA teacher, to discuss the topics that we're going to kind of bring up here. And so when we are thinking and focusing on civic environmentalism, what we are looking for our students is the type of social action where citizens are joining together, they're banding together to solve environmental problems or environmental issues within the communities they live. Some of them can be large in scope, some of them can be specific to a region or a geographic place. But the goal is really to ensure a sustainable community for future generations. So thinking again about that democratic process and how it's leveraged to protect what we have for generations to come, as opposed to just what we have right now. And that really harkens into that environmental justice lens. So the goal for ensuring that the environment is taken care of for those future generations through a democratic process. And it's a method of active citizenship that is justice focused and oriented through the environmental scope. And so for us in our webinar that we're going to be looking at today, and Rachel Carson's work in Silent Spring, just to set the stage for the environmental movement and kind of piece together where we are, so we're kind of speaking that same language. We'll fast forward a little bit to the 50s and 60s. There's some disasters that are going on from a global stance as well as from a US stance: atomic bomb testing, municipal waste dumping, chemical agencies that are just kind of going freewheeling and dealing. So citizens at this point, especially with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, are starting to gain evidence that, okay, maybe we should do something about this to protect our environment, the air quality that we have, reduce the amount of toxic waste, maybe make sure we have safe drinking water that is at a level that is, not just safe, but, quality. And before the 1970s, before December 1970, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, did not exist. So the Department of Agriculture was in charge of figuring out what chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, rodenticides were safe to use, and then of course be consumed by the populace. So it was the Environmental Protection Agency that really spanned the reforms and getting laws that were put in place and enacted that really started to push that environmental movement beyond just local organizations and groups like the Sierra Club. And so that kind of sets the stage of where we are in the context of revisiting Silent Spring. And if you are able to head to the website, you by all means can follow along with us. But I'm going to jump into the investigation, because I think this is where a lot of the fun and the nitty gritty is going to be had here. So we're going to use this investigation through the sources framework, understanding that we're contextualizing something, that this would be far more than a 45-minute class period. So we might hit fast forward a few times just to get the general idea and the gist of everything together. If you're not familiar with Rachel Carson's work in Silent Spring, it was a hotly debated book when it was published, and the overarching themes that are being discussed in Silent Spring, right? It's a powerful narrative. It's a negative narrative toward the effect of humans on the environment and on the natural world in which they live. And so when we are discussing this through the lens of that, we are talking about the very notion of how humans interact with the environment. And so as you see here, revisiting Silent Spring, following the runoff, that's a little play on words with the chemical runoffs in agriculture. And we're going to be leveraging the sources framework to go through this process and engage in this inquiry together. And so when we take a look at this, you're first going to see the sources analysis sheet. And this is what Scott had been discussing and talking about before. This is just a quick graphic organizer to help students kind of go through and get their thoughts together and follow the process. It's a scaffold. And so for myself in the classroom, I would have the students use this especially as they're engaging in the first couple of inquiries, if you will, as opposed to, always having it there per se, because we want to embed these to be skills that they do when they engage with any source. And so that source can be our guiding document for as we go through here. And I'm going to take a quick kind of breath and let you guys engage with this first source a little bit. And so our first step in the sources framework is to scrutinize the fundamental source. And for us here, I've got a political cartoon that was published in 1962 by Frank Miller, and it is entitled Backyard Battle. And the essential question that I have that I'm posing to our students here, at what cost? What was the impact of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? And so as we discuss this inquiry, we talk about the environmental movement. There is a cost, right? And that's the ethical dilemmas that we are coming into play here. We'll discuss a little further, but just to give that framework, today in modern America, we don't necessarily think about malaria very often. Zika popped up a couple of years ago, and we have these notions of how can we engage with and do these different things to protect ourselves. And so for us, we are looking at this with the understanding that DDT in the 1960s was used. It was a highly toxic chemical that affected the aquatic life, it affected the land and mammal species, but it was really effective at killing pests and rodents that were going to harm a crop or harm something like that. So what I would like to do is take a few seconds, give you guys a couple of minutes here, and I really want to scrutinize this fundamental source and kind of hear what you have to say about this. And I'm going to pop into the chat because I do have a couple of notifications there that are just showing up. So I want to make sure I attend to those as we go through. So take a few moments, dive into this source a little bit, and then we'll come back together, let's say in about a minute or so, and hear some feedback and thoughts about what you're picking up from the source I'm putting down. All right, while you guys are taking a look at that, Noah, I'll just address your question. So yes, in terms of political cartoons, one of the reasons I really like to engage with cartoons as our first step as opposed to a document. And this kind of goes the same with pictures. There's very minimal text a lot of times with the cartoons that you're selecting, if you're selecting them. So that goes back to the notion of curricular gatekeeper. And so for me here, there'd only be a handful of words that would have to be translated or would have to be accommodated for a student to take a look at this image and be able to decipher. So for those modifications, right, political cartoons in some instances are already a modified / accommodated version of the curriculum. And so with that notion in mind, that would be that first kind of aspect of getting them engaged with the materials. And then, and of course, in the next sources, and we're going to take a look at that, accommodating those sources, whether it's providing translations, abbreviated versions, really would be dependent on the student needs within your classroom. So thank you for that question. I hope that answers it. If not, we can definitely dive back into it a little bit more. And as now, you know, we're about a minute past. So I want to hear some thoughts. Either put them in the chat, feel free to unmute yourself. What are you seeing from this image that's kind of sticking out or kind of making you think, you know, scrutinizing this source and kind of tackling what might be the author's perspective, if you will? Robert, great question. Is the image supposed to represent Rachel Carson? Fear for the animals, all right? How companies are aware of the harm but refuse to do something about it. Any other thoughts? Chemical industry made sure that it was well armed. Yes, thank you. So these initial thoughts that you're having, right? We want our students to be engaging with this source. And I like this source a lot for the purposes of this inquiry and this investigation, because it is, you know, Robert, you asked the question, and the person on the left with the gas mask and the giant fly swatter and the dangers of poison spray, that is supposed to depict Rachel Carson. And so when you have her depicted here as a force, if you will, right? This is something that definitely is engaging with almost like an angry but domineering person. And then you see the person on the right, The chemical industry, it's kind of this scrawny scientist. They got the spray can, and then they got this like bazooka looking kind of sprayer that, you know, is going to tackle these things. And then, as you guys had mentioned, all of these kind of animals scurried around looking at it. I love that the insects are in the foreground of this image, because that's one of the notions, right? That, you know, we're setting out this idea that we're using these chemicals and these DDT sprays to control malaria and control these pests with these insecticides and pesticides. And these guys are kind of have that front row seat to the battle that's happening. The animals in the background are some of those larger animals, right? The birds that are back there, squirrels, there's a cow who's peering out from behind the tree, which, you know, I think is kind of representative of the agricultural industry kind of hiding. You know, Amanda puts in the chat, animals are just innocent bystanders. And Steve has here, leads me to think of the later connection to ugly apples. And so, yeah, so in this cartoon, what Frank Miller is kind of depicting is that idea of that backyard battle. And the idea that this could happen anywhere in America. And much like Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, kind of opens with this fable of it could be any town in America, any town that is just being impacted by this. So the title of the cartoon, going back to the idea of a backyard battle, you know, so you can engage with it, understanding like this is not happening in some field that is really far away from you. The authors of the cartoons definitely trying to engage with you and engage the reader to understand, okay, this is happening in a space and a place that could impact me. And so that's where I would want our students to dive into the next step of our sources framework, and it's organizing our thoughts. And there's a variation of ways that you can do this. You know, you can use a polling application that gets quick feedback from students. If you're in a virtual format, you can ask them to pop comments in the chat. Or if you're using a site like Nearpod, there's options for quick post-it notes, you know, like a traditional kind of parking lot, if you will. And for us, when we're organizing our thoughts, we're taking all these pieces of information, and we want the students to make those next steps, right? You know, so We want them to think about the things that they're going to need, but we also want to push their thinking. And so I've got some scaffolding questions here just to have them start thinking about how it contextualizes in contemporary America, understanding the sources from the 60s, and we're studying this in 2021. So, questions that I have posted here: does your family use pesticides or fertilizers? Does your school? Does your community? Do you know what's in them? And this gets the kids thinking, if this is happening in the 60s, is it happening now? How is it happening? Is it different from what we're looking at now? Do you know where your food is coming from? And this goes back to Steve's comment here, the connection to ugly apples. If we're using these pesticides to help us grow, and we're helping the agricultural industry, what's in the food that we're eating and consuming at the dinner table? And then how does your community change over the past 10 years? And I think this is a really relevant question. We talk about the dangers of pesticides and insecticides potentially, but then you can see the physical landscape of a community changing. So right here in Central Florida, you drive down a road that used to be completely green space. And now you drive down that road and there's every other day, clearing of forests, clearing of trees to make space for something else. So it gets the kids thinking that this goes beyond potentially just that microscopic level. And then this is that question that kind of is going to drive that conversation, thinking about this notion of at what cost, what's the impact of Silent Spring? If you could save 1 million people, but it would potentially destroy an ecosystem, what would you do? And so this goes back to the concept that, in banning DDT in a developed country like the United States, and other developed countries around the world, countries that were less developed, that couldn't afford more expensive pesticides or herbicides or insecticides, and there was a ban on DDT that was kind of blanketed, malaria deaths spiked, predominantly in children under the age of 5. And so you have this notion of that ethical dilemma, right? Should we do X if it saves people, but if it destroys the environment in which we're living, that's a difficult kind of pill to swallow. And so that kind of sets our stage for continuing our inquiry. And so it really has us wanting to understand the context that we're speaking to here. So the students have investigated this fundamental source. They have the stage set. They're thinking about the world that they live in and how it's kind of contextualized within it. They've organized some thoughts. They thought about maybe, hey, what sources do you need to better understand the context? And so this is that next step, understanding the context. And I have 2 columns here. We will not go through every single source here for the sake of time. But what I do want to note is that I have 2 sides here. The left-hand side is all political cartoons and images. And so going back and thinking about Noah's comment, question in the chat about scaffolding and accommodating, there is a way to do this that's not necessarily diving deep into heavy text. And the resources that you have on the right-hand side, those other resources, some of them are specific text-based, like a book excerpt from Silent Spring, which I believe should absolutely be leveraged here. And then some are fantastic podcasts. A Yale professor, those 2 episodes there, talks about environmental politics and law. Those are much longer, much more in-depth, but do provide a greater context for students, depending on the grade level that you're scaffolding for. So I want to take a moment and I want to provide 2 different examples that we're looking for. And so the consequences of Silent Spring, this is another political cartoon that was published post the publishing of Silent Spring. And it really kind of has the students thinking about, okay, we use DDT potentially to ban the pesticide to make us healthy. And then this cartoonist is taking another kind of look at, it's not just DDT, it's all these other chemicals as well, right? So expanding that thought process and expanding all these different notions of we're trying to kill this one little fly, and you can see the fly kind of spiraling down to the ground, and all the different types of chemicals and spaces that are there. And on the flip side of that, of providing a source of that nature, we have an advertisement from DuPont. DuPont was the manufacturer of DDT. And it was also the manufacturer of a lot of other not so great things, Agent Orange, some other chemicals that have known to cause severe cancers and severe issues of health. But DuPont's slogan here, I think, really paints a picture for our students to start thinking about this process that is engaging with the materials. And so you see this happy mom and daughter wearing matching outfits as they get ready to go out. And the slogan that they have, better things for better living through chemistry, right? So in this instance, not necessarily a traditional political cartoon, but this type of source engaging with the students to say, okay, you know, DuPont, the manufacturer of this, clearly a biased kind of person here or company in the instance of what we're looking at. And we're taking a look and saying, better living through chemistry. So they're advocating for the use of these chemical compounds and these pesticides and insecticides and herbicides and rodenticides, a whole bunch of sides, and really doing so from the format and, you know, for them of selling things, right? And so for us, as we go through these two different sources, it's allowing the students to really paint a picture of what those 1950s into 60s was looking like prior to the EPA passing legislation and passing laws that really, you know, in Congress passing laws that impacted, you know, the everyday citizen. And that split from the Department of Agriculture controlling what got sprayed on crops to an outside agency who was coming in and doing those things. And so for our students now, they have this grounding that Rachel Carson is battling with the chemical industry, right? So big companies like a DuPont. We have connected it for them, hopefully, to what these issues could look like for them in their everyday lives, and at least thinking about, you know, is my mom and dad, if they go home, are they using fertilizer on the grass that we have in our front yard? Do we spray things to stop weeds from growing? Oh my gosh, I don't know what the apple that I'm buying from Winn-Dixie or Publix has on it or was grown with. And so our context is now set that there was a Wild West before even what we have here in 2021. And this is where I want the students to head back, right? And read between the lines, head back to that original fundamental source of looking at this backyard battle. And again, contextualizing it within the context of the time period at the stage that is being set. In the 1960s and into the 70s, and the development of the environmental, you know, movement as we know it today, the modern environmental movement, while it's also creating those ethical dilemmas that the students are now factoring in as they look at this. You know, they might be looking at it and saying, okay, yes, I thought Rachel Carson, you know, was the hero in this story, but, you know, if we don't have a way to eliminate certain things, are we in a position that we could be impacted, you know, future generations down the line of not having certain things at our disposal? So hopefully, you know, the sources here within the understanding the context section provide a little bit of that back and forth and provide that multiple perspective that a full ban on a substance like DDT wouldn't be a cure-all. And on the flip side, a partial ban might, but it might not get to the level that we need depending on the lens we're looking at. You know, if you're a farmer, if you're somebody who's living in the city who wants cheap vegetables, if you're somebody who is engaging with the environmental process within a community and dealing with something like toxic waste runoff or pesticide runoff in your water, your lens will look different. And those sources hopefully allow students to contextualize those spaces and places. And then we jump into that next stage of our framework, which is that corroborate and refute. And the sources that I provide here, these dive a little bit deeper into a collection of resources and primary sources and secondary sources that really paint the picture of the dilemma, if you will. So there's a couple of videos that are posted there that go through the modern day impact of Silent Spring and the discussion of sub-Saharan countries in Africa that don't use DDT because of the bans or because of what had gone on and occurred, and the hundreds of thousands of people who fall ill and potentially die from it in the world that we live in currently. And the context is also provided that these mosquitoes predominantly also are becoming immune to the spraying of certain pesticides and herbicides and insecticides. So at the same time, you know, even if we continued using certain substances, our enemy, right, these pests that we're trying to control, are also adapting to the world around them, the world in which humans are the ones kind of taking that step forward with. And so what I really love about this investigation is this first section here is the first chapter of Silent Spring. And it's not long, it's actually very short for students to access. But it goes through this imaginary place in America where there's no longer birds that sing. because they all fell ill, because they ate things that had pesticides in them. And at the time, the controversy of Carson publishing this, which is another aspect of this investigation, is you have a woman in a field of science that is challenging big companies like DuPont that was not done before. Her science was questioned in the lens of these big companies saying, you don't necessarily have the data that backs up what you're saying about this fictional story. And in the same token, this was not a peer-reviewed journal article. This was a call to action in her text and in her book, which really was almost like prophetic in the section, in the understanding and the selection of the work that she was utilizing and building and creating. And so the sources here within the corroborate and refute section allow students to engage with that dilemma that's being had of, should we use this, should we not use this? How does this kind of translate and transfer into the world around me today? And how am I contextualizing this within the context of, if I'm a middle schooler or a high schooler that's really trying to understand the longevity of the impact of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And so as they are doing this, again, hitting a little bit of fast forward, the establish a plausible narrative section of this, traditionally you could do some form of writing activity, some form of graphic that allows for it. I thought this was a fantastic opportunity in terms of an assessment piece to allow the students to create their own cartoon and create their own kind of image that depicts the facts and conceptualizations, that they're discussing about the time period, and then also possibly bring in that environmental movement throughout the contemporary issues of what they may be facing. Here in Florida, over in Tampa, there's a big issue with a nuclear waste plant, some shape or form that's impacting a community, right? So depending on where you live, this could hit really close to home on a specific topic or a specific issue. And then as we get to our summarizing and our final thoughts, so we've gone through this arc of engaging with this backyard battle, expanding it out, and then bringing it back in. I have some questions that I would want the students to kind of evaluate from that ethics side, right? So should a ban on DDT be reevaluated today? We know more now than we did in the 60s. And you could replace DDT with another substance. For them, they've engaged with a lot of materials that have discussed DDT to this point, but it allows for them to really kind of understand and contextualize the notion of what a ban would look like potentially. Should other events happening now be evaluated with a Carsonian lens? And so I say that in the notion of, we have things that are happening in the world around us. And for us in the social studies, contextualizing the issue and building a connection to contemporary kind of engagement. And that's that civic and environmentalism lens, hopefully allowing the students to take what they've learned through this process that engages with, citizen action as well as political action. When we talk about legislation that is being passed, it allows for that kind of bridge to be built, and then hopefully allows them to engage with, hey, this is stuff that's going on in my life. What can I do to possibly impact and change that? The link there is a phenomenal, just quick read, but it goes through and from the perspective of our students building that context knowledge, it goes through environmental disasters in North America that have been pretty awful. And so you can take a look here and it would go through this process. And the Esri map actually has a really cool kind of time map that you can follow as well. And before students wrap up this inquiry and this investigation, our hope would be that they could come back to this question, this essential question, and say, at what cost? What was the impact of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? And not just discuss it from the lens of, well, DDT was banned, but discuss it and debate it within the context of understanding this is an issue that is still a pervasive issue today, whether we talk about things like the Green New Deal that are being discussed, or air pollution, or water levels rising with global climate change. It's an issue that can be really bridged from that contemporary lens that we have today, connecting it to that Carsonian lens of the 60s. So going back to that essential question as we wrap up and go through and say, at what cost? What was the impact of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? And so as you engage with this, Scott actually has some great resources here if you want to have ways to integrate technology throughout the presentation or throughout your investigation with your students, broken down within the framework. So you can take a look at this and actually just link straight out to resources that allow you to really build that kind of knowledge base for yourselves as you want your different ways to engage your students, especially considering the world that we're living in. You don't know if it's necessarily going to be a virtual or a face-to-face or a hybrid lesson. It really allows for these tools allow for that extension of the investigation. So I want to pause here. It's a lot of information that I threw at you, I know, and I appreciate the comments and the kind of context that you guys were providing as we went through. So I want to take a break and kind of open up for conversation, questions, kind of debate, whatever the case may be for you guys as you need, as we look toward, revisiting Silent Spring and following the runoff.
Phenomenal as always, Brian. Thank you so much. Yeah, and everybody be thinking, pop some questions in there. I have a couple of my own, but going back to one that came up, and since I know that you understand middle and high school extremely well and have taught in both, one of the questions was, and you can be thinking about with this, but in general, I think it'd be helpful for everybody, is with your students, and you've had a pretty diverse population as well, which people probably wouldn't know since they may not know where you taught and your background. So you've dealt with a lot of different students in different content areas, but what type of sources or what kind of elements have you seen within political cartoons that make them successful with different populations?
So I would say predominantly the idea of cartoons is that they're accessible. And so for me, you can take this cartoon, you take the dates off of it, and you could make an argument that it's still utilized today. So if I'm understanding the question, they're able to be accessed depending on your learners, for a broad range of learners. They're kind of agnostic in a sense. They can be kind of leveraged in middle school and high school. And of course, you can kind of tweak. Some political cartoons do have more text-based resources, or they are so nuanced that if the students don't have some background knowledge, they're not going to be able to kind of piece together those persuasive techniques that the cartoonist is using. And so for me, what I would always suggest is find some form of scaffolding if your kids have not utilized a cartoon before. The National Archives and Library of Congress both have good resources for specifically using to engage with the analysis of political cartoons. I have that on the website here, the National Archives one, specifically when you analyze a cartoon. And it allows for those students to have that scaffolded understanding of, what should I be doing? And I like the idea, you're meeting the cartoon, you're observing its parts. And so when we talk about giving it to students, we're not just throwing them a source and saying, hey, try and figure it out on your own. It's providing that scaffolded process. And then also for us, it's that notion of that curricular gatekeeper, selecting the cartoon based off your students' needs. So you might say, I have this beautiful, wonderful source, but I can't use it yet. I got to give them something to kind of, grease the wheels and get them started before they engage with something that's more nuanced and more irony-driven potentially. If I'm understanding the question right, Scott, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that definitely helps. I love that the idea you're kind of pointing to, that they can be timeless. And I saw you had the her block went up earlier, and I think a lot of her blocks, yeah, it spoke to generations in the past. It speaks to our students today. And so I think that timelessness is also really important. I think that's an interesting aspect of it. But yeah, I think so many of these political cartoons that you've shown here definitely would work with students of all ages. And even as you said, even if they don't have the contextual understanding, that's hopefully how this framework helps them to get it. So very cool. I have another question, but I want to make sure others have an opportunity if there is another. But you can be thinking, or you can go in response, since I don't see anything popping up. I don't think I see anybody unmuting yet. I'm just kind of curious overall. I mean, these are great. I'm just curious it could be something that you found after you were teaching, but let's say overall, do you have a favorite political cartoon of any topic, not necessarily just in the environmental protection era? And I'm just kind of curious how your students responded with that particular political cartoon. I know I hate to put you on the spot, sorry, but I just didn't know if one stuck out, like you remember your favorite one you ever used with a student in any topic.
Yeah, there's so many good ones.
Yeah.
I would probably say this one is up there. So my dad is a cells and molecules professor, was a science guy. So I was engaged to Carson's work very early on. And so this kind of lens of science and society and going kind of the history of how we get to now has always been, engaging with me. I actually love the one Herb Block cartoon. It's the class divide, where it's the inner city school and the suburban Heights charter. Again, because it's timeless.
It is.
And that with my students, and my students continue to pick things up that I don't see in cartoons. And it's amazing, right? You've got a 7th grader who's engaging with, primary source analysis, and they pick something up that you've spent, 3 or 4 years teaching something, and you're like, oh my gosh, how did I never see that before? But I would probably say that cartoon specifically is one that always is fun to look at, and then disappointing to look at because it's still so relevant.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, and I know that one well. In addition to the comments that you said, that's partially what I thought about that too. And it always does when other people find, especially our students, find elements that we didn't even see within it, even though we're the one who's teaching it. But I know from being in your classroom and knowing the environment that you've created, that I'm sure they all take pride in being able to share maybe perspectives and thoughts that you, whether you did or not, but at least you valued their thoughts. And so sometimes them teaching you is that added element, the added value to the whole process. So that's super cool. Yeah. As I said, I know how your classroom ran, and it was always impressive to me. And so I can totally picture that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions, anything from anybody? Then before we leave, if Brian could just maybe click on the conference link. I think you had it under more, didn't you have it on there? Yeah, thank you. I thought you did. So if you're not aware of my Sources Conference, it is at the lovely University of Central Florida, where I am happily employed. It is every January, the 3rd Saturday of each January. So it will be January 15th of 2022. It is completely free. When you get a chance, go to the actual website, sourcesconference.com, and you can see some of the past programs. If you haven't attended, take a look at some of the presentations. I don't present, so I can say without being being boastful that it is amazing. The presenters are tremendous, and then the participants, everybody there, they're the type of people that you want to spend time with because they're engaged, they care, they really want to find ways to create inquiry-based classrooms using primary sources. So it is a thrill for me to be able to host this each January. So please consider presenting, possibly, if that's something of interest to any of you. And if you aren't interested in presenting, then please try to participate. Come, it is on a Saturday, and so hopefully you'll be free for that day. Looks like we have another thought from Noah. In regards to implementing the sources method for these types of sources, may the summarizing step at the end be incorporated as either a formative or summative assessment of the source, depending on the design of the lesson. Have you developed a preference based upon the response of your students for either? Yeah, it really depends. I mean, one of the things is this is a framework that I hope people tweak and modify. I have to be honest, if you look at my, I'm going to create some other analysis sheets, but the one that I have is very much like the observe, reflect, and question from Library of Congress. But for me, I found that I kept trying to remind students, what do you know? What do you think you know? So observe and reflect didn't work as well for me, at least with my students. So that's why I tweaked this. So please feel free to tweak. So that last stage, is kind of revisiting the question, thinking about what they've learned. But I always like to remind teachers that give them the opportunity for that metacognitive opportunity to think about their own thinking. So what worked, making them to understand that they are junior historians, that they are creating these narratives. So they go through that process and think critically about each stage, what worked, what didn't. And so a preference, have you developed a preference based upon the response of your students for either? Are you saying with the formative or summative? I'm just want to make sure I answer properly. But hopefully I answered that fairly well, and maybe Noah's going to prompt me with a little more there. But yeah, that last stage really is a culmination of that. And then once again, it depends where it is in your year, how much time you devote, what other stages will come after that. So it really depends. But typically I try, just because of, I know the lack of time we have often to devote to a topic, that many times it's a 1 or 2 day. And that's where you kind of pare back how many sources you utilize in the corroborate and refute stage. But yeah, it's usually a more of a summative opportunity at that point in time. Yeah, it really depends. I hate to do that, but it's kind of like, as Brian said, I love the term curricular gatekeeper, because you are a gatekeeper of the curriculum. So it depends on your student population, what works well. And I love the idea that Brian presented, the idea of creating their own political cartoons. Now, will that work for his students? It probably does all the time. Will it work for your students? Probably all the time. But it's a big probably. So yeah, modifying, as all of you know, and those of you who are going to watch who are teacher candidates, as I always argue, make sure you know your student population first and foremost, like Brian was saying, and then you can determine whether it works for you or not. Brian and I both have spent a lot of time in different classrooms, and hopefully my framework works for a lot of different situations, but I know it won't work for every particular circumstance and population. It's all about determining what's best for your students.
Yeah, and along those lines, Scott, the formative versus summative. When you go through the framework, what I do like about the framework itself is if it's very formative driven, right? And it's built in opportunities for your students to reflect and revise their knowledge. Now, if you use the scaffolded, graphic organizer, or you adapt it on your own, you can kind of build that in, right? For me, I kind of hide the vegetables, right? Like I want them to question if Rachel Carson was correct in trying to push for a ban on these things. So the sources I provide, in that section of corroborate and refute, as well as understanding the context, provide that space for them to say, like, oh man, like I don't know, like, do I want to kill all these millions of people because I don't want to spray some stuff on plants? And then it's like, well, are we more important than the plants? Are we not? So I want them to do that. So that formative aspect of it's built in. In the summative, yeah, I think it's a choose your own adventure. A lot of times, for us here looking at political cartoons, engaging with them and having them create that, I think it's a great way for them to kind of, as a summative assessment, you could fill it in with a short writing prompt that is the essential question back into it. So yeah, definitely, like Scott said, it's a choose your own adventure a little bit, because you got to know your kids. You got to figure out what works for them. Short of giving them multiple choice tests, which we won't go there right now.
No. But I love that you said that, because I read a lot of choose your own adventures as a child. And that's one of the things that I like to pose, and I'm sure you do as well, is often thinking kind of choosing different outcomes. It's kind of like choosing your own adventure in a sense. But with this, without Rachel Carson or others, how might have the future been modified and changed? There might have been, as if you've read those books, you turn to page 35 or you turn to page 42, and depending on the actors and the agents who are involved and how the lack or absence of some of this or those individuals, you might have turned to a different page and there would have been a much uglier outcome, or there might have been different outcomes. So I think that's part of what this whole process allows your students to consider and debate and discuss as well.
Yeah. For sure. And if you're writing an alternate history, an alternate narrative, you got to know the original narrative pretty well to change those things. So I think in terms of testing knowledge, it really affords the students an opportunity to get creative. But yeah, a couple comments in the chat. Exploring the site, well organized. Well, thank you. If you have any questions or anything like that, Scott and I's email are both on there, so feel free to shoot us an email. But yeah, I appreciate your time, guys. This was fantastic. I really had a blast putting it together. Kind of tweaking what I've done with students and then kind of sharing it with you all.
Well, thank you so much. We really do appreciate everything that you have done. Cherie actually, writes, I think, something just worth pointing out, that, the sources framework allows students to move from listening about history to actively investigating. And I think, Brian, what you set up in terms of, Rachel Carson and the environmentalism, certainly showcases that. For so long, it seemed that you could go decades without a bald eagle sighting. And now all of a sudden, it seems, at least here in the South, that, they're almost a regular occurrence. And I think we can attribute that to her work in the banning of, or, getting DDT banned so that, those birds of prey could make their resurgence, just to, highlight, a future impact as a result of her work. And so, nicely done. To everyone that attended, we thank you. This has been an incredible webinar series. We have one more next week that, features Dr. Kenny Anthony of Mississippi State University. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that next Thursday at 4 p.m. So if you haven't registered, please be sure to do so through the Florida Council for the Social Studies website. Dr. Waring, thank you. Dr. Furgione, thank you. Really, amazing presentation and framework. And I know that for teachers across the country and internationally, it's definitely something worth pursuing, not only for the social studies, but cross-curricularly as well. So not seeing any other questions in the chat. Thank you for being here. Truly appreciate it. And Drs. Waring and Furgione, if you'll just hang on a bit, I would appreciate it, just so I can formally thank you. So thanks, friends.
Thank you guys all.
Everybody.